Hello and welcome to episode 83 of the Wisdom from the Akasha podcast. My name is Suzie. I am your host and I am an Akashic Records teacher and practitioner. Today, I want to give a little bit of an overview of what divine feminine energy is, why you would even want to awaken it, and of course, why is it asleep in the first place. There are a couple of days left to be able to use the discount code for the upcoming Awakening the Divine Feminine course. This is a very intensive course. It's 12 sessions over 12 weeks. That's going to be starting with me in October. You can, of course, sign up for this one until October, but that code is going to expire on the 31st of August. That's the early bird discount code. I'll pop a link into the show notes so you can go ahead and grab that code if you want it. And of course, I'll pop a link into the show notes for you to be able to sign up for that class as well. Before I get into this conversation in detail, I do want to acknowledge that some people may not like to use the terms masculine and feminine energy. These are just traditional esoteric terms that we utilize. If you would prefer to use solar and lunar or spiritualising and materialising, that is completely okay as well. I'm just going to use the traditional esoteric terms as we go through this conversation today. First of all, what is this divine feminine energy that I'm talking about in this 12-week class? In the West, spiritual traditions have often either actively ignored or just disconnected from this feminine energy. Now, everybody has internal masculine, internal feminine energy, okay? It's just a way of describing these different aspects of consciousness. And in the West, what you'll often see is there is no specific reference to a feminine aspect. Most of the time, you'll see something referred to as spirit. And when you look at the definitions of spirit in the Western traditions and compare it to the Eastern traditions, you'll see that actually that spirit that is being referred to in the West is the feminine energy that's referred to in the Eastern traditions. Now, in the Eastern traditions, this idea of feminine energy is better preserved. So you'll see in Tantra, for example, you have the Shiva and the Shakti. In the yogic traditions, you'll have the Ida and the Pingala. But I must note here that in both the Eastern traditions and the Western traditions, they have both been heavily influenced by patriarchy. So in both East and Western traditions, it has often been the case that women were not allowed to practice. Now, traditionally, men and women would go to separate mystery schools. And there's a whole host of different reasons as to why this was. To do with the biological form that soul has chosen to inhabit. There's different ways of working with the biological form if you're in a male body or if you're in a female body. But what has happened is a lot of the practices that people are coming across on their spiritual journey are practices designed by men for men. Okay? And what happens a lot with women on their spiritual journey is they start to do these practices and they start to stagnate a little bit on their spiritual journey, or they're not getting the results that perhaps their male counterparts are getting. Now, I've said before and I'll say again, everybody has internal masculine and internal feminine energy, but what I have definitely seen in my work with people over the years, with thousands of individuals, is that the men that I work with tend to have a much more comfortable relationship with their internal feminine energy than the women do. And a lot of this has to do with patriarchy, programming, conditioning that we won't get into here today. Okay? But I just want to acknowledge that across traditions, there is this understanding of this masculine and this feminine energy, but sometimes the feminine aspect is ignored, repressed, or just not worked with. So with all of that being said, it's understood through these traditions that to achieve enlightenment, there needs to be a balance of both. There needs to be a balance of the materializing and the spiritualizing. There needs to be a balance of both your solar and your lunar energies. And that balance is individual and unique to each individual. But this is what divine union is. When you hear the term divine union, it's this uniting of your internal divine masculine energy and your internal divine feminine energy, because ultimately the soul has no gender whatsoever. Ultimately, the soul has united both of these forces. What happens, of course, during an incarnation is we tend to be dominant in one or the other of these energies, and this dominance means that we're energetically imbalanced, and we need to work with the opposite energy to be able to bring ourselves into more of a balance. So what I often see with people on their individual spiritual journeys is, especially with women, an imbalance of masculine energy. So being too much in their masculine energy and having an unhealthy relationship to their internal feminine energy. One of the exercises that we do in the class together is talking about what we believe the feminine energy to be. Because you'll hear me say more than once that the feminine has 1,000 faces and 1,000 moods, and that's very true. So when we're trying to define what feminine energy is, it can be quite difficult. In class, we go through an exercise where we talk about these different aspects, and what we always see is that there are certain words that we would call healthy expressions of the feminine and certain terms that we would see as being an unhealthy expression. So I'll give you an example. So healthy expressions of the feminine energy would be flow, would be ease, would be magnetic, would be intuitive, would be receiving. Okay? So these are aspects that we understand to be connected to that feminine energy aspect that we have that are healthy. They're a healthy expression of it. However, when we are in an unhealthy expression with the feminine energy aspect, we see helplessness. We see words like shame. We see words like codependency. We see being judgmental and we see being manipulative. Okay, so both energies, masculine and feminine, solar and lunar, can have healthy expressions and they can have unhealthy expressions. I am not saying for 1 second that one energy is better than the other. They are not. They are just what they are. And they can both have healthy and unhealthy expressions. The reason that we do this exercise is to understand our starting point. So what do we as individuals believe the feminine energy to be in its healthy expression and in its unhealthy expression? Because under patriarchy, we often, especially if we are women, have a difficult relationship to that feminine energy aspect. And there's a whole host of different reasons for this. But we can often really lean towards and want to work with our masculine energy much more because it feels safer, because it feels more productive, and it feels more powerful, which is actually completely not true. But this is what we're conditioned and programmed to believe. And for women on their spiritual journey, they often have to go through a process of really understanding their biases and their feelings towards the feminine energy aspect before they can integrate it in. The spiritual journey is different for men and women, okay? And you can see this reflected in Joseph Campbell's traditional hero's journey and the heroine's journey. There's similar aspects to it, but there's also differences, and it's important to acknowledge that, and it's important to understand that this has always been understood from an esoteric perspective, that there are differences, and that's okay, and that's beautiful. So in class, we're going to identify what our understanding of feminine energy is, and then we're going to look at the heroine's journey, and we're also going to look at the different archetypal energies of feminine energy. So this is where we're going to look at those aspects. And when we look at archetypal work, it's to understand ourselves from an internal perspective. This is not to worship a being that is outside of us, okay? But we're going to look at these different aspects, these different archetypal aspects that we all have within us to really try to understand our internal feminine energy. So the first part is really understanding that internal feminine energy and then understanding how we can work with it, how we can bring it into balance for ourselves internally, in the correct balance for us. So why do we want to do this? Why do we even want to work with our feminine energy? Because we're working towards that divine union. Okay. Now, by working with your feminine energy and strengthening that feminine energy aspect within you, you're going to be able to strengthen your intuition. Intuition is very feminine energy dominant. You're going to be able to really feel if something resonates. You're going to be able to receive much clearer downloads, much better, stronger, understandable guidance from your guides, from your angels, from your spirit team. You're going to be much more creative. When you really strengthen your feminine energy aspect, you're going to take life a lot less seriously in respect of you're going to play more, you're going to feel more of that flow. When you hear people say surrender to the flow of life, you're going to actually be able to do that. You're going to be able to open yourself up to receive. So to receive, number one, and then to receive more. So really expanding that ability to receive. And you're going to be able to work much more closely and much more strongly with that internal technology. So those clair senses, that intuitive technology system that you have as a being. And of course, you're also going to be able to deepen your relationship to the Akasha, to the Akashic field. The last point I want to cover is this: why is it even asleep in the first place? And I alluded to this earlier. Essentially, just the way that we have co-created society as humanity. We've been in a very masculine energy dominant society, and this is manifested in physical reality as patriarchy. Humans haven't always lived under patriarchy, and there's lots of great books about this, which if you want some guidance on those, just let me know in the comments and I'll drop some book recommendations for you. But we haven't always as a society lived under patriarchy. But in the West, we have been under patriarchy for a significant amount of time. And therefore, we've lost the connection to our feminine energy aspects. Within indigenous traditions, there's often this reference to Earth being the mother, the sky, the cosmos being the father. There was this understanding that both aspects exist. So when you look at prana, for example, there is the spiritualizing vertical prana, the upwards prana, and there's also the horizontal or the materializing prana. There was an understanding that we are part of Earth. As Earth is evolving, so too are we evolving. And as part of that evolutionary process, what is happening is we're realizing and we're recognizing that actually we need to bring this back into balance because we've gone way out of balance under patriarchy. There is, of course, a healthy version of patriarchy and a healthy version of matriarchy and unhealthy versions of both as well. Modern life and how it's designed, again, how we've co-created it, is not very conducive to our internal feminine energy. So, for example, internal feminine energy works on cycles, and it's usually a lunar cycle. It's a 28-day cycle. And you'll see there's a lot more science and a lot more investigation being done into how this impacts you as an individual. But our lives are set up to be in a 24-hour cycle, which is much more in alignment to the solar cycle. So modern life itself is not very conducive to working with both energies or respecting both energies. There's also a lot of fear around working with this internal feminine energy aspect because working with this aspect requires you to go inwards. When you're doing your shadow work, when you're going through your dark night of the soul, it's your internal feminine energy that you're working with. And there can be a lot of fear around this, and there's a lot of wanting to work with the masculine energy because it takes you up and out of the body. Okay, it's that spiritualizing energy. It's going to take you into higher consciousness. When you're working with the feminine energy, it's about going deeper inwards. It's about going into the body. And that can be really scary for people if they have a lot to work through. If there's a lot of energetic stagnation there, it can feel very, very overwhelming. It can be much more appealing to just go, well, I don't really want to do that. I don't want to do that inner work. I'll just do these practices that help me to escape, which of course is spiritual bypassing. What I see a lot more now in the spiritual community is a lot more conversations around the importance of getting good balance of, yes, being able to go up into higher consciousness and higher dimensions, but also being able to bring that back into reality and do something with it. So that's working with both the upwards spiritualizing energy, so going up into higher consciousness, and then working with the materializing energy of, okay, and how can I use that information to help humanity, to help the collective, to help my community, whatever it may be. So there's lots of reasons as to essentially why it's been asleep, but it is beautiful to see that this is definitely something that is coming back into people's memory. We have all worked with our internal masculine and feminine energy throughout every incarnation on planet Earth. So we know this stuff. It's just now that we are remembering, and it's beautiful to see the remembrance. Now, if you're unable to come to the class, or if you're not feeling called to come to the class, a couple of books that I would really recommend for you if you've listened to this episode and think, yes, I'd really like to understand this more, but I'm not ready to do that 12-week intensive class. First book would be Awakening Shakti by Sally Kempton. Sally was a beautiful tantric teacher, and the book is specific to the tantric tradition, but it is a brilliant introduction to the feminine energy and different archetypal energies to work with. The second book I would recommend would be The Heroine's Journey by Maureen Murdoch. This goes into the different aspects of the heroine's journey, so your journey with this feminine energy in comparison to the hero's journey. Both are relevant and both should be understood, but Maureen Murdoch does a brilliant job of breaking the heroine's journey down. So those are two books that I definitely recommend you reading if you want to come to the class or not. I hope you found this episode helpful, and I look forward to seeing you next week for the next episode.